in Matthew 16:8, where we as Catholics understand that Jesus was giving the seat of authority to Peter, I have Protestant relatives who say that when Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church," that he was referring to himself, Jesus. How do we explain that to people who had that different interpretation?
Thank you for the question. Is the rock Jesus or is the rock Peter? I'd say a couple things. The first thing, and I want to primarily cite some of the Protestant authors that I cite in the book. There's a Southern Baptist preacher from the 19th century into the 20th century by the name of A.T. Robinson, who has a lot of scriptural commentary and exegesis. And he gives kind of the characteristic Protestant examples. I'm giving this just for people who may not be familiar. And he says Jesus makes a play on the name Peter, rock. And what he means there is, in Greek, Jesus says, "You are Peter, Petros, and upon this rock, Petra, I will build my church." There are a few things we're going to get to, like whether this was even originally Greek or not. But Protestants tend to say, oh, this is a word play. And so it's not clear if Peter's Petros, who's Petra. And so Robinson says, well, maybe Jesus could mean himself by this rock if he pointed to himself. And the first thing I'd say to that is, anytime you have to add the critical detail, if he pointed to himself, you're doing bad exegesis. You could also say, if he pointed to a particular rock and said, this is where we're going to build, that would be a pretty important detail. But it rejects something about the authority of Scripture to say the critical information to understand what was meant is something that we don't even have access to. Jesus wants us to understand this passage, but we couldn't possibly understand it because he didn't give us the tools to. So we have to just imagine where he might have been pointing. That's really bad exegesis. But there's another reason, too. So this is actually from a Presbyterian minister by the name of Marvin Richardson Vincent, who says this reference of Petra to Christ is forced and unnatural. If you look at the passage, here's how it goes. They go up to Caesarea Philippi, which is far, far away from where they've been doing ministry for the entire rest of all of the Gospels. And so Jesus takes them basically on a retreat, far away from everything else. And while he's there, he says to them, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And then he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And one of them, Simon Peter, inspired by God, says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So Simon Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. In turn, Jesus says, "Simon, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So in other words, these things happen in this order. First of all, Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. Then Jesus confesses Simon as Peter. Then he says that he's going to build the church on the rock, Petros, Petra. And then he personalizes it even more by giving the binding and loosing authority specifically to Peter and giving him the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So all of that is very explicitly to Peter. The idea that halfway in the middle of that, he suddenly switches from talking to Peter to talking about himself without any clear signal that he's switching the target of the blessing. The form of this is the form of a blessing, and Peter's the recipient of the blessing. The Protestant explanation that says the rock is Jesus turns it from Jesus blessing Peter to him switching blessing himself or some third party unnamed, we don't even know what the rock is, and then going back to Peter. So when Marvin Richardson Vincent says this is forced and unnatural exegesis, it's true. It just isn't. Jesus appears in the passage not as the foundation, but as the architect. On this rock, I will build. So Jesus is present in this passage, but present as the architect of the church, not the one upon which the church is built. That's the major point, I would say. But there's one more detail that's really critical. Notice that this whole debate, who is the rock, is premised on the idea that in Greek, there's this distinction between Petros, the masculine form, and Petra, which means rock. And so it's this is a word play, and Petros, since it's two different words, couldn't mean the same person. That's a bad argument in the first place. But it's a worse argument when you read John 1, verse 42, which makes it clear explicitly that the original name wasn't Petros in Greek. It was Kepha in Aramaic. And so that just means rock. So he just says, you are Kepha, and upon this Kepha I will build my church. So there's only one referent. It's rock. We know the word in Aramaic. He says, you are rock, and on this rock I'll build my church. And the only reason we lack that is because Greek is gendered in a way that Aramaic isn't. And so Matthew has to translate it in a way that makes sense into Greek. He's not creating a new separate referent, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate your going into so much detail.